Muy buenos días. And greetings again from Casa Adobe, the intentional Christian community of which your missionary James and I are part in Costa Rica. I'm sure several of you have been to Costa Rica and enjoyed the sun-bathed beaches and the dramatic volcanoes. Costa Rica receives many tourists every year. It's also receiving hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees, so many that the local authorities are alarmed and struggling to make space for them all. The country does, however, continue opening its doors and seeking welcoming ways forward. Today's scripture readings pose some shocking invitations and point towards the fact that contrary to the ways of our world, and often even of the church itself, in God's economy, there is space for all. We're going to engage with these invitations as a drama in 3 acts. So Act 1, an invitation to return home. Deprivation, violence, uncertainty, hopelessness, these are conditions binding millions of people around the world today in Latin America and beyond. In this country, rising tribalism and extreme polarizations are ripping families and churches apart. Not dissimilar were the conditions the people of Israel had during their long exile in a foreign land. It's in the midst of that uncertainty, in the midst of exile, that they receive good news. Into that reality comes a soothing invitation from God through the prophet Isaiah in what we know as Isaiah 55. Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters. And you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. Now, the promise of abundance includes provision for all their needs. Come, eat. And far more, give ear and come to me. Listen that you might live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, my faithful love promised to David. God offers those tired, bedraggled people full life. God offers to covenant with them, to restore the relationship broken by their unwillingness to live out God's purposes. God is inviting them back into the intimate communion they had lost. God is calling them back home, back to their true identity as humans created in God's image. God is willing to forgive, to embrace, and to start afresh. Verses 6 and 7 again. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will freely pardon. So beyond their physical needs here, there's provision, but there's also restoration, forgiveness, all promises of goodness which will bring celebration and worship, not only for people, but from nature itself. You will go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. To the people burdened in their condition, these words nourished hope. The day would come when their suffering would end. They would return to their land, and their lives would be reconstructed to their previous glory. Creation itself downtrodden as it was by war and drought, by disregard and irresponsible plunder, creation itself would be restored. Worship would burst forth. Now, this is Act 1 of the play, the invitation out of exile and into full life, a renewed, worshipful relationship with their Creator, back to their true creaturely identity. Chapter 56 of Isaiah takes us to Act 2, and this is a yet more shocking invitation. This chapter is part of a section written once the people of Israel are actually already back home, back in the land of Canaan. The reconstruction has begun, but the expected prosperity is slow in coming. People are still suffering and still stand in need of encouragement, and that is what they expect from the prophet. The first call is not too surprising, nothing too new. Maintain justice, do what is right, for my salvation is close at hand, and my righteousness will soon be revealed. Blessed is the one who does this, the person who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath without desecrating it, and keeps their hands from doing any evil. After centuries of teaching, those that choose to are aware that their covenant with God demands following the commandments given by Moses. Not doing evil, keeping the Sabbath are unquestionable expressions of right religion. The law and the prophets had taught this for centuries. No huge surprise, though, although it clearly was not that easy to walk the talk. But nothing in their mindset prepared them for the next calls. Maintaining justice and doing what is right is not about right religious acts, but about right relations. And this pushes far beyond the barriers of comfort. Because Isaiah says this, let no foreigner who is bound to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. And let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. Foreigners. Hebrew tradition did acknowledge foreigners as special recipients of God's favor. God's law made provision for their care, ensuring, for example, that fruit and grain were left after reaping so that the poor, of whom the foreigners were the most vulnerable, could feed themselves. Israel's history prominently included foreigners, women like Rahab and Ruth. However, foreigners were typically also excluded from worshiping God alongside the Jewish people. They were not clean enough. They were other. So were the eunuchs. By law, they were not allowed to join in the public worship of God. Here, however, in the voice of the prophet, God issues two shocking invitations. Not now to the usual expected insiders. Instead, God is inviting the outsiders, the ones traditionally excluded from fellowship, into full belonging as part of the worshiping community of believers. And God's promises to them are even more extravagant than to the usual insiders. Regarding eunuchs, suffered men weighed down by shame and rejection, who will never bear children and whose name consequently will be lost, God says, verses 3-5, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath, who choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will endure forever. God addressed these nobodies and welcomed them into intimate communion with God's self. They too can step into God's covenant of life. God promises to grant these people discarded by society a name better than sons and daughters. To these people who, by not having descendants, could easily be forgotten by future generations, God promises an everlasting name. Against all prejudices and exclusions, God affirms their dignity and intrinsic value. And God's outrageous invitation insists on addressing other lesser people. Isaiah continues, and foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. As we mentioned, although Jewish tradition allowed foreigners to become proselytes, that is, to confess the God of Israel as the one true God, these outsiders were never allowed to worship God fully along with them. They were marginalized by those who felt far superior. They were not more than second-class citizens. But God welcomes them and affirms that in God's house and in God's work in the world, there is room for people who seek the Lord from all nations. Not surprisingly, then, this is the text that Jesus cites centuries later when he cleans out the temple in Jerusalem. The problem on that occasion is not simply that merchants had set up business in the temple and are probably exploiting the poor pilgrims who have traveled to Jerusalem from the rural areas. That is a problem, but there's another one. What angers Jesus the most is that they have set up their stalls precisely in the patio of the Gentiles. This is the area designated to welcome foreigners into God's presence. By setting up their stalls there, occupying the space, they're depriving foreigners from access to worship and belonging. Jesus reminds everyone, my house is a house of prayer for all nations. There is space for all. Jesus will not tolerate any attitudes or actions, personal or structural, that hinder access to the full life God intends for all people. So finally, we move to Act 3. COS, you and me, and shocking invitations today. Clearly, this last act is ours to perform. So a few questions in closing may help us as we step into this plot. First, might there be a sense in which we are living today in some sort of exile, even in the midst of our relative prosperity and security, in which we, too, may be distanced from our Creator and overly absorbed in life-sapping preoccupations? Are we personally or corporately in need of hearing that first invitation, God's call home? Are we thirsty for God's loving embrace in order that we too might recover our true identity? Let's be reminded again of God's invitation through the words of the prophet. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord. and he will have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will freely pardon. God yearns to welcome us home. God yearns to welcome each of us home. But there's more. God also yearns to use our very arms to embrace those no one else welcomes. This is part of our true vocation as God's people. Now, you better than I know who the eunuchs or the foreigners are in U.S. society today. You better than I know what barriers, personal and structural, were built historically and are still being built to exclude them from full belonging and real fellowship in the Christian community or in U.S. society at large. So, what is the church doing to remedy the centuries of exploitation, exclusion, degradation, and violation of the most basic human rights suffered by the people who first inhabited these lands? Or the people trafficked from Africa and forced into slavery? Or the thousands who today are being driven from home and land because of violence and global warming? Do you know, or do you care to know, what injustices must be confessed and what steps must be taken in order that both here and wherever in the world U.S. presence is felt, the marginalized, the least privileged, the outsiders will also have access to the full life God intends for all people? Jim and I could share with you what we see happening in Central America thanks to U.S. migratory policies and business interests, and how the livelihood, the rights, and the health of entire populations are being violated. Necessary questions are, who are the foreigners and eunuchs in West Michigan that God is calling you to invite in today? In what ways are you challenged to embrace them? What next steps can you take? The ancient Israelites were called to not dwell on their own limitations and misfortunes, but to receive God's loving embrace and regain their true identity. In turn, they were challenged to step into their true vocation and embrace the most vulnerable among them. We too stand in constant need of regaining our true identity and stepping into our true vocation. May God grant us love, grace, and courage to respond to God's shocking invitations today and in the days to come. May we acknowledge in word and deed that there is space for all. And may we walk in justice so that everyone and everything may go out in joy and be led forth in peace. Amen.